So I've installed EEGLAB and ERPLab, but now I want to import the data that I've recorded in my EEG system into the program. How do I do that? Very simple. First of all, to open up EEGLAB, you type EEGLAB into your MATLAB command window, and then you press enter. This will open up an EEGLAB window, but at present it has no current data set. To import my data into EEGLAB, I have two potential means to do so. First of all, if I've never touched this data before, if it's just in the pure form that was spat out by my EEG system, I'm going to use File, Import Data. If I've edited my data in any way, or even just opened it and saved it in EEGLAB, I'm going to need to use File, Load Existing Dataset, because EEGLAB saves the data in a different format and you can no longer simply import it. So if I want to open up my data for the first time, I'm going to go to File, Import Data, using EEGLAB functions and plugins, and then I'm going to select my data type. For me, this is Neuroscan CNT because that's the format that my data is produced in. You may need to mess around with how your data is saved and churned out by your EEG system, but you should be able to find some means to import it depending on the format that is produced. So I then navigate to the folder that my data is stored in. So for me, it's in my desktop in a folder called EEG Training. And I can see it here, dataset1.cnt. I may wish to have a look at other datasets. Perhaps I'm not sure whether or not I've already saved this dataset, pre-processed it. In order to do so, I can just click on All Files here. And I can see that for me, I've already played with this dataset, so I have an EEGLAB FDT and set file. But for first time import, I'm just going to stick to CNT. I click on the dataset, and then I click OK. This will bring up a Load CNT dataset menu. Most of the time, for most people's purposes, you can just leave this as it is. You don't actually need to change anything. Auto detect is typically fine. So I'm going to just press OK. The next pop-up asks me what I want to name this dataset. Importantly, this isn't what I'm naming the dataset on the computer or the laptop that I'm working on. It's just the name that EEGLAB is going to use to refer to the dataset. So for me, I will just call this dataset 1. Once this loads, I can see my dataset and I can see some basic information about it. So channels per frame, this refers to the number of electrodes you have on your system. So this might vary from 32, 64, 128, or some number around that depending on how many eye electrodes and other electrodes you're using. Don't worry too much for now about frames per epoch, but epoch here just means that we only have one continuous recording. We've not cut our data up depending on the different triggers, which we'll get to in a moment. We just have one long data file. Events, these are my triggers. So as you'll know, for every EEG dataset, you send triggers into the continuous file that tell you when a participant is hearing or seeing or even potentially responding to stimuli. So this just tells me how many of those events, how many of those triggers I have in my dataset. Sampling rate we'll talk about shortly when we look at one of the other stages of EEG pre-processing. And then we have the start and end of our file, and it just tells me how long my file is. I would quickly glance over this just to be sure that everything looks okay. For now, we'll leave the rest of this information, but for importing a dataset, these are the simple steps you need to follow.